Hello, my name is Michael Ray, and I'm the Director of the American Indian Program here at New Mexico State University. We thank you for joining us once again as we continue our series on our digital platform. As we all wish we can come together, we look forward to doing it again soon. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we wish you a good day.
So moving forward, and we'll come back to that a little bit. Moving forward, we move into the next period, which we call the last of the blank, or we call it the dying, the dying Indian. Made popular, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. There's also a very interesting dynamic that begins to occur here, which is what we call transference. And we talk about it in terms of like playing Indian, right? We set a model where the white character, our Daniel Day-Lewis Hawkeye character, begins to take all of the nativeness, right? He becomes more native than the natives. As the natives are dying out, he absorbs all of the native power, that native magic that we just saw, speaking to animals and communing with nature. He comes into this particular space, being able to do this now. And as all the natives die off, all the Americans can go forward with all of this native history. We see this today. I know Michael knows, like, we've seen some of this stuff up with the kids that are doing our traditional dances up in Southern Colorado, where they're doing, because, and literally they say this on the website, that because they are trying to save our traditions, because the native folks are going to die off, right? This is not a new phenomenon. This is what happens right here. This is how the Boy Scouts were founded 200 years later, on the same mentality that we will take all the native concepts because natives apparently were closer to nature and were amazing. And what we get into is that it's about this idea of magic and spiritualism and mysticism, rather than recognizing that native folks on this continent had built incredible civilizations, trading networks, power, diplomatic core powers, warfare. The problem is, if you walk into a space and you wipe out 90% of the population in the span of 50 years, it's going to be a lot easier to come into that space, is all we're saying, right? It's very easy to understand how a lot of this stuff gets missing. So we see this now, this idea of transference. And during this time period, this is the 1700s to the early 1800s, there are no less than 7 different plays that reference the last of the blank. There's a great book. I will show it to you here from my shelf. This book is one of the best ones that I found. I think this will be in reverse, but if I can't show it. Native Americans as shown on stage, 1753 to 1916. Really great resource. Very hard to come by. This is one of my prized possessions. My precious. But this is where a lot of that information comes from. And it's really important to note that during this time frame, it wasn't just representational media, say political cartoons or illustrations and whatnot. It was plays, it was theater, because this is a burgeoning literate society in America. Not everybody can read, not everybody's going to the private schools and can pick this up, but plays, some were definitely for the elite, but a lot of them were for the masses. So the masses got this sense, and especially because what we know within pop culture is if it's popular once, it's going to be popular. In America, we're going to ride that train till the wheels come off. So not showing that it's just one time, there's 7 different plays. So we know that it was popular for many, many decades. And it continues to reinforce this idea that natives are dead or dying. Now, this has the impact. Now we start to see propaganda, because we have a society that is expanding into the West, into these new areas and locations. And I will say this right now, knowing how we're all dealing with, like, social media and everybody kind of losing their minds because we're all inside for too long. But I tend to believe that humanity, human beings, do bend towards justice, or that they tend to understand morality, right? Because I think it's very difficult, or we know that you can do the right thing, but when you spend all your time trying to justify the wrong thing. So when you spend all your time justifying this guy, and you showcase that, like, well, they're dead and dying anyway, so it's cool if we take their land, because we know we're not supposed to take their land. That's messed up, right? So we create a series of propaganda to be able to then justify that taking the land, which then influences policy. Because if you have a populace that is willing to be able to do this, then you can set policy and tone and tenor uh, that will reinforce that and allow that populace to feel comfortable in these decisions that have been made that benefit them, but may be catastrophic to another group of humans, and especially the indigenous people that were here. So at that point, we changed the dynamic. 1824, Andrew Jackson is elected, and we know Andrew Jackson don't like no native folks up in this space. So and it's absolutely fascinating. Within this book, almost overnight, the native representations of media change like that. And they change from being this sort of noble savage or this dying Indian. It's still respectful. It still pulls the romanticism out. And they change into this new character that we term the Red Devil. We are now really moving into westward expansion. It's not just into the Shenandoah Valley anymore. It's not just into the Hudson Valley anymore. We're now trying to clear out the entire plains. This is Manifest Destiny. Jackson starts it. It goes through all of his predecessors all the way into the 1900s, when we think 1890. We think the end of the, quote, Indian Wars and Wounded Knee and the massacre, although there were still skirmishes that went on. That essentially reservationized everybody in this space. When you're fighting a war, you need a villain, right? We're seeing that in real time right now as everybody's struggling to figure out who a villain is. We can't figure out a villain, but when you want to move people into this space, you got to have a villain. This villain is epitomized by this character, Injun Joe. For those of you that had to read old Tom Sawyer back in the day, some of us do, some of us don't. When I talk to the younger kids, they ice that out of the canon for the kids having to read this these days, but a lot of us did. And for decades, a lot of us did. This is the most popular book in the mid-1800s. It sold more copies. It made the name of Mark Twain. And really what people tend to forget is because we sort of like nostalgize that it's like, oh, look at that rascal Tom, and he's whitewashing the fence, and he loves Becky, and he goes to school. But the villain is Injun Joe. Injun Joe is the villain. And you can see in the linotype that went with the original book, Injun Joe, this Tom dreams, has a nightmare that Injun Joe's coming in to stab him in his sleep. Injun Joe, as the native character, ends up being killed at the end of it by being trapped and buried in a cave. And so the metaphors and the analogy that comes into play is that Mark Twain is writing about the death of the old America, the indigenous America, to be taken over by Tom, the rascally upstart America, right? White America. So that's what happens. And the fact that that Injun Joe is buried in the cave, right? He doesn't even get like a warrior's death. He gets like a coward's death in this space. So you see that happening and taking place. And this perpetuates and permeates the entire space. This is what the Westerns are built on, a native villain, right? We have to have this villain to understand that we are at war. And if we're at war, colonial America is at war with the indigenous people in this space who are defending their homeland, essentially. They're defending the treaties that they made in this space and getting wiped out. But it's easier for a populace to find this palatable, to swallow this, if the main character is a villain. And so we move into sort of our last realm. And this comes in around the 1900s. We move into what we call it two terminologies: the neo-noble savage, who comes back in the 1900s, or the tragic chief. And I love it's epitomized right here, especially by Iron Eyes Cody, not native, Italian. This is Redface, right? Environmental. So what happens is, in the turn of the century, native folks now are finally getting to go to college, right? The East Coast has definitely been colonized and assimilated. The Central Plains, kind of the same thing, and the West Coast is moving in the same direction. So this is by the turn of the century. Native folks are kind of like, listen, we're going to have to, concede or die. And so the boarding school starts. And so native folks are accessing education. Well, as we're accessing education, we get an insight into how the mechanics of Western society work, which means we start writing. We now begin to control our own media. Morning Dove, Charles Eastman, Ohiesa, who else am I thinking? Darcy McNichol. These early native writers begin to start putting their own stories into play. And it still fulfills the Western romanticized notion of native folks, but it's now starting to be a little bit more on our terms. There's a little bit more nuance, and there's a little bit of the actual history and recognition. Well, America at the time starts to feel a little bit bad about the fact that they have practiced ethnocide, genocide for the last 200 years. And so native folks begin to move their way back into the collective consciousness, both romanticized, but also heroic and moving back into that noble savage, except there's a tragic aspect to it now. And if you look back at the early cinema, especially things like the Jim Thorpe story with Burt Lancaster, you see that it's always this sort of duality. The native character is like, usually has a non-native girlfriend or white girlfriend, and he has to like, he has to be like, I am going to go home to my people, and I'm sorry, I love you so much, but my people are the most important, right? And I was watching these movies when I got older. I was like, dude, you can take her with you. Like, did you just want to get out of this relationship? Is that why you did this? Because like, that sounds to me like you got some excuses, brother. Like, you're like, I don't want her no more. I got to go find someone else. Because like, if we know historically, everybody welcome, just come, yeah, baby, come on in. You one of us now, right? So we know that's how it would work. But the romanticized notion of Native folks within this space, this tragic aspect. And we see this represented here because especially as we began to move into the environmental movement in the environmental space, Native people began to be re-identified with the noble savagery of the Native aspects and where they came from, and that they were closer to nature, and that we could talk with the wind, hair blowing in the wind, that we could talk, like that I could touch trees. And again, highlighting the same thing that happened 400 years before, Native folks are being used as a counterpoint, not on our own merits, not with our own identity, but we are being used as a counterpoint to the ways that now greedy, dirty, terrible Americans are acting. Look, you should be acting like the noble savage who's crying as somebody throws some trash out of their car on the ground. And of course, if you know this is the crying Indian motif. We know that you've made it into pop culture sphere if it makes it onto The Simpsons. And if anybody's watched this episode, it is actually particularly hilarious. I do love this ending for that particular episode of The Simpsons, because the dude looks behind him and it's just this pile of trash, and then he just screams at the end of it. So I highly go back and look at it. It's on Disney Plus. You can check it out. There's my Disney Plus plug. I'll be expecting my check from Uncle Walt here pretty soon. So that's where we kind of end in this space, and we can really see this today. We still see this in these spaces, and I'll go back to why I'm titling that article, White Folks Love Dead Indians. The last 3 movies that came out that featured major Native characters or major Native theme were Woman Walks Ahead, Wind River, and Hostiles, right? So this is in the last 5 years. Woman Walks Ahead talks about the spirit of resistance, but puts a non-Native woman as the main character with Sitting Bull, and how she kind of helped him in this space. And we can talk about, like the white saviorism, we can go into that. But really what I look at is the fact that it plays off the idea of the tragic narrative. We know what happens to the Lakota folks at that point. So what we're playing is this counterpoint of making non-Native people feel better about how they help Native folks out. Hostiles basically is good Indians versus bad Indians. So the Red Devil versus the Noble Savage. The Noble Savage is the ones that help out the cavalry and the white folks in the army on that. And the Red Devil are the ones that try and fight against that. Again, trying to protect their own homeland because they're not conceding to colonization. They should just roll over and everything will be fine. And we see this also specifically in the representations of Native women. 50%, almost half of the books that represent Native women in children's literature represent 2 characters, Pocahontas and Sacagawea. And you can go check this out. Check it on Amazon, right? You'll look through the list, 50% of the women that are represented. We don't talk about Native women warriors. What we talk about is 2 Native women that were in service of manifest destiny, not necessarily of their own accord, but perpetuating that mythology of American, the American expansionism. So these 2 women represent more than anybody else. We don't see anybody about Lozin, or, you get some modern interpreter, you get some Wilma Mankiller, but you don't see any of these, you don't see War Woman of the Cherokee. You don't see any of these Native women, Lakota women that were obviously warriors within the space, because if you're in warfare, everybody be fighting, right? So that's a lot of the, that continuous perpetualization of that Native identity that factors in. And the last one, of course, with Wind River is just a whole bunch of dead Native women, right? Which is why I have seen the trailers, I've seen the reviews, but I actually have refused to watch it just out of my own thing. It's because I don't feel right watching a showcase that just highlights and spectacularizes and objectifies, once again, the the fact that Native women are missing and murdered. It didn't bring anything to light in my mind. I was like, we know that there's a lot of things that are happening. It made a nice vehicle for some incredible Native actors, which I think they did a marvelous job. And I always have to separate that out, as we can critique things. We don't have to cancel everybody as part of those things, right? Like we're in this space that it's like, I can critique Wind River without having to like say that the person that was a part of it sold out or did whatever. I was like, no, I want you to have a job. You're a Native actor. But I can also say that I don't think that really helped the cause. I like to see live Native women being like badasses, I want to see a Native woman with a war club, going at it, like stabby in the middle of the night, so that we don't underestimate them, right? So in most of that, we see these representations of Native people coming into these spaces, and we can see this out throughout comic books. I love pointing out some of the titles: White Indian, Straight Arrow. This is the comic book representation of this. A couple of them you can't see under there. Scalp Hunter is a Native character from this from the 50s in this space. And one thing I forgot to point out is in the 50s, one of the other things is that we start to forget, because the nostalgia goggles go on, is a lot of these things that we sort of like half remember. Davy Crockett. Anybody all watch the Disney Davy Crockett? I think everybody forgets the subtitle. Davy Crockett, Indian Fighter, is the subtitle of the character. It was the most popular television show in the 1950s. It was watched by a third of the population of the United States, right? Of people that had television. So this is how we get here, right? And this is the part that when we talk about why Native folks are constantly pushing back against this stuff, but even our own folks, I tend to believe, don't have a full understanding of how deep the history goes. I think a lot of incredible work has come out around the media representations, film and television. Real Indians, fantastic documentary. I highly recommend it. REEL, Indians. But I don't think that it goes deep enough to understand that this has been jammed into the American psyche for 400 years, and then subsequently jammed into our own psyche. As Native folks and the existences that we have, we also perpetuate a lot of these dynamics. We come into these spaces thinking that, that we're not quite aware of how we have existed in response to this or subsumed by this. Now, why do I point that out? The reason why the dead and dying Indian thing is so hard for me, and why I do clickbait and why I come at people on it, definitely, is because working with Native young people for so many years, what I've seen is if you continue, and I did this, and I know this because I did a lot of gang work as well with non-Native communities. They did a study years ago, I want to say 20 years ago. I don't know if they followed up recently, but they did a study with gang members in South Central in Los Angeles. And one of the things that they found in that time is the kids that were going through these schools didn't believe they had a future. It was a nihilism that existed, right? And so what it did was perpetuate the risky behavior. If I don't feel that I got a future after 18, I'm dead anyway, or I'm in prison, right? So might as well live now. It's the worst YOLO, because it's like, you only live once, but it's like you only live once with a very, very tragic, terrifying future, one of nothingness. And that's what they see within their daily lives. We see that within our res-based communities. We see that within our urban-based communities. But then we also have this overlay of the propaganda that tells us that Native folks ceased to exist in 1890. There's the erasure. Dead and dying Indians, continuing to showcase that, continuing to show that in the media, then inflicts and influences the psyche of my kiddos, and the kiddos I used to teach all the time. So if they believe that they are dead and dying and they have no future, what do they got to live for, right? So a lot of the work we've been trying to do is really about indigenous futurisms and like showcasing all of this. But this is where it comes from, right? This is the start, and this is how it is sunk into the consciousness, and how we're so very unaware. It's why I am a scholar of pop culture, because I think pop culture permeates our brains in ways that we don't understand. You got kids wearing Spider-Man shirts. They don't even know who Spider-Man is, but it's everywhere. because it goes along with the marketing, the capitalization, the economics, and that also plays out in terms of Native identity. So going back to my original premise, when we look at what's happening currently now with the virus and the pandemic, and you see articles in the New York Times that are like, oh, look at the sad and tragic Indians. Look at how they're dying. All I can see is, yeah, and you guys are just continuing the line that it's okay. You know, one, you haven't done anything about our communities, even though we've asked, we've begged. All you want is to fulfill your narrative so that you feel good, bad, or whatever, you know, satisfied about our identity and existence. I'm much more interested in stories of resilience. I'm much more interested in stories of Native folks taking care of their families and their communities. And I'm much more interested in showcasing, you know, how we, not only did we survive in the face of terrifying, truly a, you know, a Walking Dead type of thing, right? Like we are the ones that survived the apocalypse to begin with. But how we have continued to hold to our cultures and our communities and take care of everybody, even in the face of all of that. And how right now, currently, we're rebuilding our own media and our own understandings so that we can begin to tell our own stories in a way that allows our future generations, our young people, to take spirit, to take heart, and showcase how awesome they are. I'm going to flip through these real quick. You can just see some really cool stuff. And then I want to just leave a little bit of time if we have a little bit of time for questions. But this is just some of the media that's coming out right now. Video games, role-playing games, science fiction and fantasy, fashion, futurisms, right? Like this is crazy weird and awesome, right? This is Virgil Ortiz. This is his Pueblo interpretation of what it looks like in the Pueblo Revolt hundreds of years from now. So there's our stop. I'll put back on that. But yeah, I don't know if you want to unmute. We want to ask questions. I don't know how it works. You can raise the hands. I have no idea how technology works anymore in this day and age.